Lyuba Vinogradova, Defending the Motherland, The Soviet Women Who Fought Hitler's Aces, with an introduction by Antony Beevor, translated from the Russian by Arch Tate, in memory of Nikolai Menkov and Valentina Krasnoshokova, two extraordinary people it was my good fortune to know. Introduction. Antony Beevor, Defending the Motherland is the fascinating story of the female pilots who fought for the Soviet Union in the Second World War, a unique phenomenon in the history of modern conflict. Inspired by the intrepid aviators of the interwar years, young women had flocked to join flying clubs in the 1930s. For many, their dream was to emulate the great Marina Raskova, a beautiful aviatrix and famous Soviet heroine, whom we soon discover was also secretly an officer in Lavrentiy Beria's dreaded NKVD secret police. Following the Nazi invasion of June 1941, Raskova used her prestige and contacts in Moscow to form a group of 3 all-women aviation regiments in the autumn and winter of 1941. There was to be a fighter regiment, a night bomber regiment, and a long-range bomber regiment. Raskova was clearly a natural leader, and when she issued her call for volunteers, hundreds of young women from different walks of life traveled from all over the Soviet Union in the hope of being accepted. They were not downhearted when they found themselves issued with uniforms and greatcoats that were far too large and made them look ridiculous, nor even when handed Red Army underwear for men. They fashioned their own, ideally from German parachute silk. Russian machismo did not pay much attention to Soviet theories of sexual equality. The girls, as they were always known, were mercilessly mocked and teased, yet they had far fewer crashes in training than any of the male units. Raskova's young women, most of whom were in their early 20s, had to prove themselves by being more skilled and more courageous than the men, yet male commanders remained deeply reluctant to allow them to engage in combat. Raskova's little air army assembled in southern Russia at the large airbase outside Engels. Almost all her volunteers with flying experience wanted to become fighter pilots. Only the most experienced and intrepid were selected. Raskova commanded the long-range bomber regiment herself. Exploiting her contacts in the Soviet hierarchy once again, she managed to obtain the new PE-2 dive bomber for her regiment, although it was not an easy aircraft to fly. But perhaps the greatest courage was needed by the pilots and navigators of the night bomber regiment, which flew flimsy U-2 biplanes. Navigation in the dark, with only the most basic instruments, required a very cool head, and their crews were not allowed parachutes until late in the war. Their main combat mission was to fly over enemy lines at night, switching off their engines to glide in like ghosts and drop small bombs. The Germans, on hearing that the pilots were women, dubbed them the Night Witches. The stories of these courageous young women also tell us so much about Soviet society under Stalin. It is Lyuba Vinogradova's great achievement after so much research to have been able to assemble such a detailed picture of their lives, their hopes, their idealism, and also their disappointments. I am not surprised since, having worked with her on and off for just on 20 years, I have seen how brilliant she is in archives, cleverly handling the dragons who guard them, and then, with her instinct for the telling description, spotting the nuggets which make all the difference to bringing the period to life. I greatly look forward to her next book, which will be on the young women snipers in the Red Army. Preface. I first started my research into Soviet female wartime pilots in the spring of 2009. Incredibly, in spite of having collaborated for many years as a researcher with various historians and focusing closely on World War II, which involved reading thousands of pages of documents and hundreds of books, I was not even aware of their existence. or that of American and British female ferry pilots. I learned about them from the French historian Claude Quetel, director of the Memorial de Caen in Normandy, and a specialist in the history of World War II. Claude was convinced that someone had to write a biography of Lilia Litviak, the White Rose of Stalingrad, as she was very often referred to in publications, a girl who achieved great renown as a fighter pilot before she was killed in her early 20s. He suggested this project to Antony Beevor, my own friend and mentor, and Antony in turn suggested it to me. Of course I was interested. I am not a historian, but I have always been fascinated by stories about people's experiences, and at no other time did people have such dramatic experiences as during the war. Lilia's seemed such a remarkably powerful story. This slender, blonde girl with shining eyes and a courageous heart, a gifted pilot. Another pilot tried to convey a sense of Lilia's rare talent by explaining that she could see the air, and a rebel who was never afraid of her commanders. And she had had a love affair with a young, brave pilot who also died too soon. But straight away I realized that one could not really write a book about her alone. Lilia died at the age of 21, when her life was just beginning, and before she had the chance to experience all those things that might make up a volume of biography. Together with this realization there came an idea. I should tell the story of Lilia and her comrades, those who died and those who survived the war. I did not want it to be simply a collective biography. I was keen to use the experiences of these young women pilots and their mechanics to help give an account of the first 2 years of the war. I also ended up writing some chapters about male pilots, those whose regiments Litviak and her squadron joined at Stalingrad in 1942. I started reading up and, as I did so, looked for veterans of Marina Raskova's 3 female regiments who might still be alive. It turned out that the pilots themselves were almost all dead. Because they needed to clock up a lot of flying hours to be allowed to join Raskova's regiments, they were generally older than their crews. But I was very lucky to meet Valentina Nemenushaya, née Petrochenkova, from the female fighter regiment. She was the first person to explain to me the kind of qualities a girl needed to be able to fly a fighter. Unfortunately, there was no second visit, but it was through her that I met Elena Kolkova, née Malyutina, a heroic bomber pilot and a very special, generous and strong intellectual person, who is now and will always be my dear friend. Elena introduced me to hero of the Soviet Union Yevdokia Pasko, from the Night Bomber Regiment, who told me how she and her friends flew at night in tiny plywood and canvas training aircraft. Elena also gave me addresses in Saratov, where I met navigator Olga Golubeva-Teres, who became a writer in her later years, and Elena Lukina from the Heavy Bomber Regiment. Across the Volga from Saratov, I was able to see the town of Engels, the place where Raskova's regiments were first stationed. I called Stepan Mikoyan, who was a young pilot during the war and after the war became a famous Soviet test pilot. It was to Stepan's regiment, the 434th, at Stalingrad, that 4 of the girl pilots were sent in September 1942. We have met several times, and I am extremely grateful to this amazing man, a fearless pilot and a great storyteller, for letting me catch a glimpse of the atmosphere in which he lived in September 1942, and for sharing some fleeting memories of the 4 girls who fought alongside him during several incredibly hard weeks. And now it is time to write about 2 people who brought my main characters to life and made my book what it is now, a story based on the recollections of some of those who were there, who saw the dramatic events with their own eyes. I still cannot believe my luck. Not only because these 2 people fought alongside Litviak and Katya Budanova, who also flew fighter planes with great distinction, but also because they were such special, rare people, people who make the world a better place with every step they take. I found Nikolai Menkov's name in the semi-fictional account of Lilia Litviak's life written by Valery Agranovsky, who quoted Menkov's letter giving details about the missing girl, whose aircraft he serviced, and the plane. The letter, written in the 70s, mentioned that he lived in Cherepovets. What happened next was nothing short of a miracle. I found Nikolai within 20 minutes of learning of his existence. His telephone number was in the Cherepovets online database. When I called, he answered immediately and invited me to come and see him. I visited him and his daughter Tatiana several times, and each time was unforgettable. A kind, warm reception and fascinating conversations that ranged well beyond the war and aviation. On one of these visits, I brought along the regiment's documents, and Nikolai read and commented on them. All of a sudden, the documents came to life. "I am so sorry, but I don't let strangers into my apartment," Valentina Krasnoshokova explained politely when I called her first. However, I did not visit alone. Lydia Zaitseva, the record-setting Soviet sports pilot, a lovely, kind person, brought me along to Valentina's tiny flat in Kaluga. There were portraits of Litviak and Budanova on her shelf, and I made a beeline for them. Some are included in the book. Kaluga is only 150 kilometers away from Moscow, to the southwest, and it was my great luck that I was able to visit Valentina often. We would talk about the female fighter regiment, and about the 437th and 9th regiments, as well as the 73rd, which she left in 1944 when she was badly wounded. The two girl pilots who died in the summer of 1943 were sometimes present in our conversations, but not always. Valentina had memories to share that were a lot more important to her than Litviak and Budanova. I came to love her dearly, and so was willing to listen. I recorded and will keep many of her stories about events that happened long after Lilia and Katya had died. For example, how, when Valentina was working at the Oblast Party Committee, she rescued the Soviet Bard Bulat Okudjava from a teaching position at a village school where he had been exiled by the authorities, or how she sat all night comforting a new arrival at the boarding school for children with hearing problems, where she was for many years director. Valentina was almost completely deaf as a result of concussion in 1944. Once I accompanied her to a supermarket and two girls greeted her in sign language. They were too young to have been her students at the boarding school, so she asked them how they knew her. The girls explained using signs. "People say that a long time ago there was a kind director at our school." I felt very touched. This exemplified my friend, a kind and active person who always helped those who needed her. Valentina Krasnoshokova and Nikolai Menkov, who both died in 2012, will always be in my thoughts. I believe they would have been glad to know of the existence of a book that would tell the world a little about them, about their comrades, and about the regiments in which they served so hard and risked their lives in order to bring victory closer. Lyuba Vinogradova, November 2014, Maputo, Mozambique.